It all started with a 911 call we couldn't trace. Dispatch got it around 11:48 p.m. A man's voice, shaky and muffled, whispering something about "it's coming" before the line went dead. Protocol demanded we check it out, so I grabbed my coat and headed out, assuming it would be another prank or someone too drunk to finish a sentence. The address led me to an abandoned stretch of road just outside the city, where industrial buildings loomed like forgotten giants under the pale moonlight. I was the first to arrive, but my flashlight barely pierced the shadows as I approached a decrepit warehouse at the location provided. It was eerily quiet, no wind, no hum of traffic in the distance, nothing but my own cautious footsteps crunching on gravel. That's when I heard it, a faint, irregular tapping sound coming from inside. My pulse quickened as I unlatched my gun from its holster. The warehouse door creaked louder than I liked as I pushed it open, revealing an expanse of darkness. I called out, "Police! Is anyone there?" My voice echoed, swallowed by the cavernous void. And then I saw it, a light. Not just any light. This was a pulsating, dim red glow emanating from the far corner of the warehouse. Something about it made my stomach churn, a primal fear clawing at my rational mind. I advanced slowly, the tapping growing louder with each step until I realized it wasn't random. It was rhythmic, like a signal. Reaching the light source, I stopped dead in my tracks. On the floor, surrounded by a crude circle of salt and ashes, was a camcorder, its lens pointed at an empty chair. The red glow was coming from the camera, though it wasn't plugged into anything. I stared at it for a moment before my radio crackled to life. "Officer, are you on site? What's your status?" the dispatcher asked. I pressed the button to respond, but before I could speak, another voice, raspy and distorted, cut through the line. "Don't turn around." I froze, my thumb hovering over the radio's call button. The warehouse air felt heavier, colder. That voice didn't belong to the dispatcher, and it definitely didn't belong to anyone else on my team. My instinct told me to draw my weapon, but my hands were glued to the radio, my breath caught in my throat. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing against the concrete floor behind me. I couldn't help myself, I turned. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. There was nothing there, just the dimly lit void stretching back toward the entrance. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were circling me now, coming closer with every loop. My flashlight darted in every direction, searching for the source, but it illuminated only empty space. And then I felt it, a shift in the air behind me, like someone exhaling on the nape of my neck. I spun around again, my flashlight beam slicing through the dark, but the light landed on something that shouldn't have been there. The chair. The one the camcorder had been pointing at moments ago. It was now occupied. A man sat slumped forward, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if his neck couldn't support its weight. He wore a filthy hoodie, the hood pulled low over his face, obscuring all but his mouth. It was stretched into an unnaturally wide grin. "Sir," I barked, my voice cracking. "Stay where you are." He didn't respond. He didn't even move. But then the camcorder clicked to life, its tape whirring as the red glow intensified. The man's grin widened impossibly further, and his chest heaved with a sound that wasn't breathing. It was laughter. A low, guttural chuckle that clawed its way up into my ears, louder than it had any right to be. I raised my gun. "Put your hands where I can see them," I demanded, my training barely keeping the panic in check. The man twitched. Not like a normal twitch, a jerky, inhuman movement that sent his body convulsing in place. His head jerked up, and I saw his eyes, white, hollow, reflecting the crimson glow of the camcorder. And then, without warning, he stood. Not gradually. He snapped upright, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. The laughter stopped. That's when I heard the tapping again. It wasn't coming from the man or the camcorder this time. It was above me. I tilted my head back, my flashlight trembling as it illuminated the steel rafters. My stomach plummeted. There was something up there. Its limbs stretched impossibly long, bending in ways no human anatomy could. Its head swiveled to look down at me, its eyes glowing red like twin coals. "Get out," the man hissed, his voice a guttural growl that sounded as if it came from the thing above rather than from him. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted for the door, my boots slamming against the concrete, the tapping sound now a thunderous chase overhead. But as I reached the exit, I realized the door was no longer ajar. It was sealed shut. And then the lights went out. Darkness swallowed everything. My flashlight sputtered and died, leaving me in total black. The air was suffocating, pressing down on me with the weight of unseen eyes. I clawed at the door, my fingers searching desperately for the latch, but it wouldn't budge. Behind me, the laughter returned. This time it wasn't just one voice, it was many, low and guttural, blending into a cacophony that made my ears throb and my knees weaken. "Help!" I screamed into my radio. "Officer needs assistance. I'm trapped. There's something here." My voice cracked, but the radio responded with only static. No, not just static. Beneath the hissing, a faint whisper. "Why didn't you listen?" I spun around, pressing my back to the door, my gun trembling in my hands. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear them, shuffling, scraping, those unearthly movements that seemed to come from all directions at once. Then the camcorder's glow returned. A faint red light flickered on, casting its eerie hue over the space. It illuminated the man in the chair, but he wasn't sitting anymore. He was standing in the same jerky, puppet-like stance, his head tilted sharply to one side, grinning. But the worst part wasn't him. It was what the light revealed in the shadows behind him. Figures, dozens of them, standing impossibly still, their bodies blurred and indistinct, like smudges on reality itself. Their eyes burned red, and they seemed to sway ever so slightly, like trees caught in a ghostly breeze. They were watching me. I raised my gun, my finger hovering over the trigger, but I couldn't aim at all of them. My mind screamed to run, but where? The door was sealed, and the shadows surrounded me. Then the man moved. He didn't walk. He glided. 1 second he was by the chair, and the next he was in front of me, his face inches from mine. His grin widened, splitting his cheeks as if his face might tear apart from the strain. "You shouldn't have come here," he rasped, his breath reeking of decay. "They've been waiting." I didn't think. My instincts took over and I pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the warehouse, deafening in the confined space. The red glow flickered and died again. I couldn't see if I'd hit him, but the laughter stopped. The oppressive silence that followed was somehow worse. And then the tapping started again. Above me, around me, closer this time. I stumbled backward, my gun shaking. The red afterglow burned into my vision. The air shifted, and I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. Something whispered directly into my ear, "Run!" The door behind me gave way. I fell backward, crashing onto the gravel outside. The cold night air hit me like a slap, and I scrambled to my feet. I didn't look back. I sprinted toward my patrol car, every nerve in my body screaming at me to keep moving. When I reached it, I dove inside and locked the doors, my hands fumbling to start the engine. It roared to life, and I floored it, gravel spraying behind me as I sped away. In the rearview mirror, the warehouse loomed, its broken windows glowing faintly red. The tapping followed me, faint but persistent, as if it were inside my skull. The next morning, I filed my report. I told my superiors about the 911 call, the warehouse, and the man. I didn't mention the figures or the thing in the rafters. They wouldn't believe me anyway. But when they went to investigate, the warehouse was gone. Not empty, gone. Nothing but a scorched patch of earth remained, as if it had never existed. And now, every night since, I've heard the tapping. Always faint, always close. And I know, sooner or later, it'll find me again. It's been weeks since the night at the warehouse, and the tapping hasn't stopped. It's relentless, always in the background, like a shadow I can't escape. I hear it when I'm alone in my car, when I'm sitting in my apartment, even in the station. No one else notices it, they all carry on like nothing's wrong. But I know better. I've started sleeping with the lights on, Not that it helps much. The tapping grows louder at night, echoing through the walls, the ceiling, even from under my bed. I've checked every inch of my apartment. There's nothing there. But somehow I feel like I'm never alone. The worst part? The dreams. Or maybe they're not dreams at all. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back in that warehouse. The red glow, the figures in the shadows, the thing in the rafters, they haunt me. But the man in the chair is always the same. Always grinning. Always closer. Last night, it escalated. I woke up at exactly 3:33 a.m. to the sound of my radio crackling. I didn't have my radio on. It was sitting on my nightstand, turned off, but the static was unmistakable. Then a voice, his voice. Low, guttural and mocking. You can't run forever. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my gun and checked every room in the apartment, my heart hammering in my chest. Nothing. The doors were locked. The windows were secure. But when I returned to my bedroom, the camcorder was on my bed. The same camcorder from the warehouse. I don't know how it got there. I don't know how it's following me. But I couldn't bring myself to touch it. Its red light was pulsing faintly, like a heartbeat. Like it was waiting for me. This morning, I brought it to the station, hoping someone else could deal with it. Maybe forensics could trace it, or maybe it could just disappear into evidence, forgotten forever. But when I got to my desk, it was gone. In its place was a single sheet of paper. A message scrawled in jagged handwriting. You let them out. I haven't told anyone about this. They already think I'm on edge after the warehouse incident. I don't need to give them another reason to doubt me. But I can't keep this to myself much longer. Something followed me out of that warehouse. Something I can't explain and something I can't stop. And now it's spreading. Yesterday, another officer responded to a disturbance in an abandoned building across town. His report sounded all too familiar. Untraceable noises, a strange red light, and figures in the shadows. He hasn't shown up to work since. And the tapping is not just in my head anymore. I hear it at the station now, faint but growing louder. Other officers are starting to notice it too. This isn't just about me anymore. Whatever I brought back from that night, it's here. It's waiting. And it's only a matter of time before it takes us all. The station has become a pressure cooker of paranoia. Every officer has heard the tapping now. It's faint at first, like a loose pipe or a distant knock. But as the nights drag on, it's grown louder, more persistent. Some officers brush it off, saying it's just the building settling. But I've seen the way they glance over their shoulders, the way they startle at shadows that weren't there a moment ago. And I know better. I know it's not the building. Last night, we lost Officer Reyes. He was one of the new guys, a transfer from another precinct. Reyes was tough, built like a linebacker, the kind of guy who didn't rattle easily. But when the shift ended, he stayed behind, claiming he needed to finish some paperwork. This morning, he wasn't at roll call. When we checked the security footage, the station's cameras showed Reyes pacing the locker room, muttering to himself. At 2:17 a.m., the feed cut to static for exactly 1 minute. When it came back, Reyes was gone. His locker was open, and inside was the same message I'd found on my desk. You let them out. The chief tried to downplay it, claiming Reyes probably left on his own. But we all know better. The locker room door doesn't open without triggering the cameras in the hallway, and those feeds stayed perfectly intact. He didn't leave through the door. I haven't been able to sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see their faces, the figures from the warehouse. They're getting clearer now, less like smudges and more like people. Except they're not people. Their eyes burn red, their mouths twisted into those impossible grins, and their movements are jagged, like marionettes with tangled strings. And then there's the man, the one from the chair. He's always watching me in the dreams, his head tilted, his grin stretching wider each time. Last night, I woke up to find my bedroom window open. I live on the 3rd floor, and I never leave it unlocked. On the windowsill was a small pile of salt, the kind that had circled the camcorder in the warehouse. Something is coming for me. Tonight, the station feels different, colder. The tapping has evolved into a steady pounding, like fists slamming against the walls. The lights flicker intermittently, casting the bullpen in eerie strobes. No one speaks anymore. We're all just waiting. At 11:48 p.m., exactly the time I'd received the original 911 call weeks ago, the power went out. Complete darkness swallowed the station, and for a moment, the only sound was the pounding, now deafening, reverberating through the walls. Then came the laughter. It started softly, a low chuckle that rose into a chorus of manic cackles. It came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the station like a twisted symphony. My flashlight shook in my hand as I scanned the room, catching glimpses of my fellow officers frozen in fear. And then they appeared. The figures from the warehouse emerged from the shadows, their red eyes piercing the darkness. They moved toward us in jerky, unnatural strides, their grins wide and malevolent. One of them spoke, its voice a distorted growl. "It's your turn." Chaos erupted. Officers screamed, some firing their weapons, but the bullets passed through the figures as if they were smoke. I ran, my heart pounding, the laughter and pounding following me. I dove into the evidence room, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My breath came in ragged gasps as I tried to steady myself. But the pounding didn't stop. It was right outside the door now, relentless and unyielding. And then silence. The calm was somehow worse. I gripped my gun tightly, my hands slick with sweat, waiting for the next move. The red glow returned, seeping under the door, casting the room in its eerie light. The camcorder was on the evidence table. It wasn't there before. The tape inside clicked, and the screen lit up. The footage showed the station, our station, but it wasn't empty. The figures were inside, standing in perfect rows, their red eyes staring into the camera. And at the center of the room was me. Not the me holding the gun in the evidence room, but another me, sitting in the chair, my head tilted at an unnatural angle. The camera zoomed in as the other me grinned, its mouth stretching wider and wider until it filled the entire screen. The last thing I heard before the tape cut to static was my own voice, distorted and alien. "You let them out. I don't know how long I've been sitting here. The pounding has started again, louder than ever. The door won't hold much longer. If you find this recording, don't come looking for me. Don't come to the station. Burn it all. Every record, every piece of evidence, every trace of this nightmare. And whatever you do, don't answer the call." The pounding on the evidence room door stopped as suddenly as it had started. The silence that followed wasn't relief, it was suffocating. My body trembled as I pointed my gun at the door, bracing for whatever might come next. But nothing did. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. I couldn't tell anymore. The red glow from the camcorder faded, leaving the room bathed in darkness. My breaths came in shallow gasps, every muscle in my body coiled tight. Then the whispering started. It was soft at first, like distant murmurs carried on a breeze. But it grew louder, the words indistinct yet filled with venom. It came from all directions, surrounding me, pressing against my skull. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it did nothing to stop the noise. "Fight back," I muttered to myself, trying to drown out the whispers. "You're not dead yet. Fight back." I grabbed the camcorder. If this thing was the anchor to whatever nightmare had followed me from the warehouse, then maybe destroying it would end this. My hands shook as I raised the butt of my gun and brought it down on the device. The impact sent a shockwave through my arm, but the camcorder didn't crack. It didn't even scratch. I slammed it again, harder this time, but the whispers only grew louder, turning into screams. The walls of the evidence room seemed to ripple, the air thick with static and a sense of dread so heavy it nearly crushed me. Then the door creaked open. Not burst open, not slammed. Just a slow, deliberate creak that sent chills racing down my spine. My flashlight flickered to life on its own, its beam landing on the threshold. The figures stood there, filling the doorway, their red eyes burning like embers. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They just stared. And then, from the shadows behind them, the man from the chair stepped forward. He looked the same as he had in the warehouse, his body jerking with every movement, his head tilted at that impossible angle. But now he held something in his hands. A mirror. He held it out toward me, and for a moment, I didn't understand. But then I saw my reflection. It wasn't me. The face staring back at me was twisted, its eyes black pits, its mouth stretched into that same inhuman grin. I stumbled back, dropping the camcorder, but the image didn't leave. It stayed in my vision, etched into my mind, mocking me. "You can't fight us," the man rasped, his voice echoing with 1,000 others. "You're already ours." "No!" I screamed, raising my gun and firing. The shots rang out, deafening in the small room, but they didn't touch him. He didn't even flinch. The figures moved then, surging into the room like a wave of shadows. I tried to run, but they were everywhere, their cold, smoky hands grabbing at me, pulling me down. The whispers turned to roars, deafening and maddening. I felt myself slipping, my vision dimming. And then, just as I thought I was about to be consumed, I heard a voice, a real voice, over my radio. "Officer down at the station. All units respond." The shadows recoiled as the voice echoed through the room. The figures froze, their red eyes flickering like dying flames. The man with the mirror tilted his head, his grin faltering for the first time. And then they vanished. The pounding stopped. The whispers faded. The room was silent once more. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, my body shaking uncontrollably. The camcorder was gone, as if it had never been there. The door burst open, and a squad of officers flooded the room, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They found me there, clutching my gun, tears streaming down my face. "They've put me on leave." The official story is that I suffered a mental breakdown after witnessing too much trauma on the job. The station has been shut down, undergoing renovations, they say. But I know the truth. It's not over. I can still feel them watching, waiting. The tapping hasn't stopped. It's just quieter now, lurking at the edges of my perception. They'll come back. Maybe not for me, but for someone else. And when they do, I hope whoever faces them is stronger than I was. Because once you hear the tapping, it's already too late. Weeks passed, but the memories refused to fade. I left the city, hoping distance would grant me peace, but the tapping followed. It was quieter now, an almost imperceptible background noise, but its presence was a constant reminder of what had happened. I couldn't stop thinking about the camcorder. Where had it gone? Why did they let me live? Questions clawed at my sanity, pushing me closer to the edge. Sleep became a fleeting luxury, and when it did come, it was filled with dreams of red lights and hollow eyes. One night, I decided I couldn't run anymore. I needed answers. If I was ever going to find peace, I had to know the truth. I broke into the old station. The building was a husk of its former self, the renovations little more than a cover story. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and neglect. My footsteps echoed in the empty corridors as I made my way to the evidence room. The door was still ajar, hanging loosely on its hinges. Inside, the room looked untouched, as if frozen in time since that night. My flashlight scanned the shelves, searching for any clue that might explain what had happened. And then I saw it. The camcorder. It sat on the evidence table exactly where I'd last seen it. My breath caught in my throat as I approached, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The red light on the camcorder was faint, barely visible, but it was enough to send a shiver down my spine. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to leave, to burn the building down and never look back. But I couldn't. Not this time. I pressed play. The screen flickered to life, and my heart sank. The footage showed me, sitting alone in my apartment, staring blankly at the wall. The timestamp was from the previous night. I watched in horror as the me on the screen stood up, moved to the window and opened it. My movements were slow, deliberate, like I was in a trance. Then I turned to face the camera. The me on the screen grinned. It wasn't a normal grin. It was the same grotesque, impossible expression I'd seen on the man in the chair. The grin stretched wider and wider until it consumed the screen, and then the footage cut to black. The camcorder clicked off. Behind me, the tapping began. I spun around, my flashlight darting through the room. But there was nothing there. Just the empty shelves and the peeling walls. But the tapping grew louder, reverberating through the air, vibrating the very floor beneath me. And then I saw them. The figures emerged from the shadows, their red eyes glowing faintly. They didn't move this time. They just watched, their presence suffocating. At the center of them stood the man from the chair, holding the mirror. But this time, it wasn't my reflection in the glass. It was everyone. The officers from the station, the dispatcher, Reyes, and then people I didn't recognize, dozens, maybe hundreds of them, all staring back at me, their faces twisted into those horrifying grins. "You brought us here," the man rasped, his voice echoing with 1,000 others. "You'll take us further." The mirror glowed, its surface rippling like water. I felt myself being pulled toward it, an invisible force dragging me closer. My feet refused to obey as I fought against it, but it was no use. The last thing I saw before the mirror consumed me was my own face, grinning back at me. They say I disappeared that night just like Reyes and the others. The station was officially condemned, sealed off as a danger to the public. But the tapping hasn't stopped. It's moved on now to another city, another precinct. Another poor soul will answer a call, thinking it's just another night on the job. And they'll learn the same truth I did. Once you hear the tapping, it's already too late. It starts in a city far from the first one, where the shadows of the previous events have long been forgotten. A rookie cop, eager and untested, sits in his patrol car on a quiet night shift. The radio crackles, a sound that barely stirs him from his boredom. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice echoes faintly through his speaker. The reply is static at first, garbled and distant. Then comes a voice, shaky and low. "It's coming." The rookie frowns, leaning closer to the radio. "What's your location? What's coming?" But the line goes dead. Across town, in an old, half-abandoned building, something stirs. The shadows seem to stretch and twist unnaturally, pooling together into a shape that defies logic. A faint red glow flickers to life in the corner, illuminating the dusty floorboards and cracked walls. A camcorder sits in the middle of the room, its lens pointed at an empty chair. The red light blinks steadily, like the heartbeat of something alive. The chair moves, creaking slightly, as if someone unseen is shifting their weight. And then the tapping begins. The rookie arrives at the location given by dispatch. It's not what he expected. Just an old warehouse, its exterior weathered and forgotten. The faint glow of his patrol car lights casts long shadows on the walls as he steps out, his flashlight sweeping across the entrance. "Police!" he calls out, his voice steady but uncertain. "If anyone's here, make yourself known." No reply, just the sound of the wind whistling through broken windows. But as he steps inside, he hears it. Faint at first, but unmistakable. The tapping. Back at the precinct, the dispatcher stares at her screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She's tracking the rookie's location, but something's wrong. His GPS signal is flickering, jumping between the warehouse and somewhere miles away. "Unit 14, do you copy?" She tries over the radio. Static. The tapping begins in the dispatch room. Soft, almost gentle, coming from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. She freezes, her eyes darting around the empty office. And then, from the corner of her desk, a camcorder blinks to life. Its red light casts eerie shadows, and the screen flickers on. It shows her, sitting at her desk, staring at the screen. Behind her, in the grainy video, shadows begin to move. She turns slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. But there's nothing there. Just the faint sound of laughter, low and guttural, coming from the camcorder. The story begins again, the cycle repeating in another city, another precinct. Another unsuspecting soul will face the horrors lurking just beyond the edge of reality. And the tapping? It's louder now. Months have passed, and the events from that night have become whispers in the dark corners of law enforcement. Officially, it's been written off as urban legend, cops telling ghost stories to pass the time. But the truth has a way of surviving even when buried. The tapping has moved on, spreading like a virus to cities far and wide. Precincts close without explanation. Entire blocks are evacuated for renovations or environmental hazards. But those who've heard it know the truth. In another city, another precinct, Officer Daniels, an experienced cop hardened by years on the job, sits alone in the briefing room. The station is unusually quiet for a Friday night, the kind of quiet that sets his nerves on edge. The tapping starts. It's faint at first, like raindrops on a distant window. Daniels ignores it, chalking it up to the building's old plumbing. But as the minutes tick by, it grows louder, sharper, like knuckles rapping against the walls. He radios the dispatcher, but the line is dead. His phone has no signal. The air feels heavy, and the station's lights flicker. Daniels draws his weapon and rises from his chair, his eyes scanning the room. "Who's there?" he calls out, his voice steady but tense. No response, just the tapping now echoing from every direction. In the basement of the station, a camcorder hums to life. Its red light pulses faintly, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The footage it captures isn't of the basement. It's of the briefing room, showing Daniel standing alone, his gun drawn. But the reflection in the monitor isn't quite him. The Daniels on the screen begins to grin. As the tapping crescendos, the station's doors slam shut, the windows rattling in their frames. Figures emerge from the shadows, their red eyes glowing, their movements jerky and unnatural. They surround Daniels, their grins wide and menacing. But Daniels doesn't scream. He doesn't run. He lowers his gun, his face twisting into a grin that mirrors theirs. When the other officers arrive the next morning, the station is empty. Desks overturned, papers scattered, walls scarred with deep, claw-like marks. The surveillance footage is corrupted, but one frame remains intact. Daniel standing in the center of the briefing room, his grin stretching impossibly wide as the figures close in. The tapping never stops. It's in the walls of every precinct, in the static of every radio. Those who hear it are marked, drawn into a cycle that can't be broken. And somewhere, in a forgotten corner of another city, a camcorder's red light blinks steadily, waiting for its next victim. Because the truth is simple, the tapping doesn't leave. It only spreads.
When I first came across it, I was on the verge of panic. Heavy footsteps in the basement, a strange smell, and this quiet but palpable trembling. Every time I thought that I would not find him anymore, he appeared again. I knew this would be my last night if I didn't escape. My work in a safe neighborhood told me that nothing happens here. But as I began to investigate, one thing became clear. Brutal murders had become a part of my life. The secrets of the small town seem attractive on the surface, but underneath lies hell. Later, I realized that all the tracks led to an old warehouse that had not been used for a long time. I noticed traces of blood and smells that smelled creepy. My instincts screamed of danger, but curiosity outweighed fear. Once, when I came across an expanded map with points where people disappeared, I realized that this is not just a game. It was serious, and every mark on the map was clearly marked. In the warehouse, I found old photos scattered on the floor of the victims. Their gazes were full of horror, and their faces were ordinary people who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. My first meeting with him was scarier than any of my worst nightmares. He was like I had not imagined, calm, self-confident, but with darkness in his eyes. I could feel my heart pounding, and every muscle in my body tried to escape. Every attempt to report him to the police ended in nothing. No one believed me, and I began to doubt my sanity. Maybe I just lost my mind, and it was just a figment of my imagination. Over time, I learned that he knew how to play smart. Every time I tried to rest, I heard his voices in my head, and there was no escape from them. I started keeping a journal to keep from going crazy. With each page, I felt my fears grow stronger and reality blur. My investigation led me to a new trail, several places where people who disappeared without a trace used to live. All these places turned out to be equally creepy and dangerous. One day, when I was trying to find new evidence, I received a message from an anonymous person. The text was simple: "I'm always there. You can't run away." My attempts to discover where these messages are coming from have been unsuccessful. He always knew what I was doing and where I was going. I felt completely defenseless. Every day it became clearer that this is not just a maniac. It was an elaborate game in which I was only one part. His goal was to understand how far I was willing to go to reveal the truth. Night visits to my apartment began to become regular. I thought I could hear his breathing when I slept. I felt trapped in my own home. Every time I thought I could find a way to stop him, he always found new ways to make me doubt myself. I started to lose my identity, and he played with my mind. I learned that his victims were not random. They were chosen for a reason. Their lives and stories were pieces of a larger puzzle he was trying to solve. My meeting with him became even more terrifying when I saw that he had a list of new victims. I was on this list, and I understood that every next step could be my last. It was impossible to get out of this hell, and I began to notice that he was trying his best to impress me emotionally, not physically. It was hard for me to determine where my reality ended and his manipulation began. Every time I thought I could prevent his next move, he always found a way to confuse me. I began to ask myself if I could even hope for salvation. He left no stone unturned when it came to breaking my will. Every night I woke up thinking that today might be my last day. With each new day, it became clearer to me that this is not just a struggle for survival. It was a battle for my soul, and I knew that if I couldn't handle it, I would lose not only my life, but my identity. Every time I found a new trail or new evidence, he always knew how to distort it, or even destroy it. My struggle seemed hopeless, but I could not allow myself to stop. His goal was simpler than I thought. He just enjoyed my fear and watched me fight for my life. It was his way of proving that he was always in control. I found out that he's planning his last game. This game wasn't just about killing. It was about how far I was willing to go to survive. The more I learned about him, the more I realized that his behavior was part of a bigger picture. He didn't just kill. He conducted experiments that questioned the very essence of human nature. My attempt to find help from friends and relatives ended in failure. He moved so fast that I couldn't prevent his next move, and it made me feel completely isolated. I realized that I needed to act quickly to unravel his plans. Each new day brought new horrors, and I began to notice that he was trying to make me a part of his terrible fantasies. My nights turned into sleepless nightmares where I tried to find my way out of the maze of fear he created around me. I knew that if I didn't find a way to escape, I would lose myself. With each new act, his plan became more and more obvious. I realized that he was not just a serial killer. He was a psychological manipulator who played with my deepest fears. He knew my darkest secrets and used them against me. Every new piece of evidence I found was part of a grand plan that he had thought out down to the smallest detail. My struggle with him became even more difficult when I realized that he knows my every move, and his plans are always several steps ahead. I could feel my patience wearing thin and fear becoming a daily reality. I started getting strange calls that made me doubt reality even more. The answers I received were cryptic and reminded me that I was always under surveillance. Every attempt to escape was unsuccessful. I could feel my environment becoming more and more hostile, and my chances of salvation were melting away along with my self-belief. I knew that his goal was not just to intimidate me. He wanted to break me psychologically, make me doubt my mental balance, and make me feel hopeless. In every new place I went, I found new traces of his presence. He always left something to remind me that I would never be safe. I learned that his activities were not just random. All his actions and manipulations were part of a complex game where he tried to test my limits and determine how far I was willing to go to survive. I began to understand that he had a plan, and that plan was much bigger than I could have imagined. He created situations that forced me to be on the verge of a nervous breakdown. I decided to collect all the pieces of information I could find and try to build a model of his psychology. It was the only thing left, to figure out his motivation and break his game. My attempts to find support from other people failed again. No one could understand why I was so alarmed, and I was left alone with my fear. Every time I thought I had found the key to the solution, he always found a way to destroy my attempts. I began to feel trapped, and each new day brought new challenges. His plans were intricate, and I understood that he was watching my every move. My attempts to decipher his motives became more and more difficult. My situation became worse and worse, and I began to doubt whether there was even a chance of salvation. I felt my strength melting away, and fear became an integral part of my life. I decided to try a new approach. Maybe if I can check his personal history and find his weak points, I can find a way to stop him. My attempts to find out more about his past have been unsuccessful. He left very few tracks, and I felt that every step I took only brought me closer to danger. My nights became a real nightmare, and I began to feel that my life was on the edge. I learned that he had his own idea of justice, and it was a brutal game of survival. Over time, I began to notice that he shows interest in my loved ones. This made me even more anxious, and I knew I had to find a way to protect them from his attack. My attempt to find new ways of salvation turned out to be more difficult than I imagined. He always knew what I was doing, and his manipulations became more and more complex and psychologically loaded. I learned that he uses people as part of his game. He manipulates them to achieve his goals and make me feel even more scared. My efforts to find proof of his crimes were futile. He always knew how to destroy the tracks and leave me in a state of constant fear and uncertainty. I began to suspect that he would try to kill me through a public place. I tried to avoid all possible traps, but he was always one step ahead. My attempts to get help from law enforcement were fruitless. I felt trapped and knew I had to act on my own to find a way to stop him. I began to notice that he was increasingly concentrating on psychological pressure. Each new act was aimed at making me feel hopeless. Over time, I learned that he was able to manipulate situations in such a way as to create the appearance of control. It was part of his plan to make me feel completely defenseless. I began to see signs that his mania was taking the form of a big game. His every move was calculated, and he played with my emotions to throw me off balance. My attempt to decipher his plans always ended in failure. I felt that every step brought me closer to the end, and he already had my destruction planned. With each new act, he showed how well he understood human psychology. He used my fears and weaknesses to increase his dominance. My conversations with him became more and more violent. He played with me like a puppet, and I began to lose the ability to distinguish reality from his manipulations. I decided to try to understand his motivation through an analysis of his past. Perhaps understanding the roots of his evil will help me find a way to stop him. My search for evidence and information about him was difficult and dangerous. He was always one step ahead, and my every attempt to find new tracks ended in danger. I began to notice that he was using people's fears against themselves. It was part of his game to create situations that made people feel even more helpless. I learned that he was manipulating information to confuse me. Each new piece of evidence seemed like part of his... Maybe understanding his mind games will help me find a way to win. My efforts to identify his weak points were fruitless. He had new ways to manipulate and make me feel afraid. I learned that he has his own idea of justice, which is not subject to discussion. His plans and actions were based on his personal beliefs, which I could not understand. Each new day brought new challenges. He always found ways to keep me on edge, and my patience was at its limit. I found out that his plans were getting bigger and bigger, and he was trying to manipulate not only me, but also the people who were close to me. I began to notice that he was using psychological games to instill fear in everyone around me. This was part of his plan to expand the circle of his power. My attempts to find new ways out of the situation ended in failure. He was always ahead and knew how to keep his game at the highest level. I decided to try to change my strategy and focus on what I could control. It was the only thing left to maintain control over one's own actions and decisions. My struggle with him turned into a real psychological war. I felt that every new day was becoming more difficult and dangerous. I learned that he has his own motivation and plan that is part of the bigger game. His actions had nothing to do with logic, and that was part of his manipulation. My attempts to find support from the people around me ended in failure. I was left alone with my fear and uncertainty. I decided to turn to experts in the field of psychology to learn more about his methods of manipulation. It was the only thing left, to try to unravel his psychological games. My efforts to discover his plans and motives were unsuccessful. He always found ways to deceive and manipulate me. I began to notice that his manipulations were becoming more and more complex. He used every possible method to maintain his control over the situation. My struggle with him became even more intense when I realized that he had big plans beyond what I could imagine. I learned that he uses different tactics to improve his game. These were complex psychological games that I had to unravel in order to find a way to stop him. My attempts to find new ways of salvation were fruitless. He always had new methods of manipulation that made my struggle even more difficult. I decided to focus on understanding his personal motivation. Maybe this will help me find the weak spots in his plans and find a way to win. My efforts to unravel his plans became even more difficult when I realized that he had his own version of justice. It was part of his game, and I had to find a way around his rules. I learned that he has his own philosophy that guides his actions. His plans were part of a larger game in which he tried to manipulate everyone around him. My struggle became even more intense when I realized that he was using his plans as a tool for control. I had to find a way to figure out his motives and stop him. I began to notice that his plans were becoming more and more convoluted. Each new step was part of a big game in which he tried to keep me in suspense. My attempts to find new ways out of the situation ended in failure. He was always one step ahead, and his manipulations became more and more sophisticated. I decided to contact a psychologist to learn more about his methods of manipulation. It was the only thing left, to try to understand him and find a way to stop him. My attempts to figure out his plans became even more difficult when I realized that he was using every possible method to keep me in suspense and fear. I learned that his plans became even more extensive, and he tried to manipulate not only me, but also everyone around me. My struggle became even more intense when I realized that he had new plans and goals. Each new day brought new challenges and dangers. I began to understand that his manipulations became even more complex. He used all possible methods to keep me in suspense and fear. My efforts to unravel his plans became even more difficult when I realized that he was using psychological games to achieve his goals. I decided to try to find new ways to unravel his motives. Maybe this will help me find the weak spots in his plans and stop him. My struggle became even more intense when I realized that he was using every possible method of manipulation. Each new day brought new challenges and dangers. I learned that his plans were becoming more and more complicated. He used all possible methods to keep me in suspense and fear. My attempts to find new ways of salvation ended in failure. He always had new methods of manipulation that made my struggle even more difficult. I decided to focus on understanding his motives and plans. It was the only thing left, to find a way to solve it and stop it. My struggle became even more intense when I realized that he had big plans beyond what I could imagine. I learned that his methods of manipulation are becoming even more sophisticated. He used every possible means to maintain his control over the situation. My struggle with him turned into a real psychological war. I felt that every new day was becoming more difficult and dangerous. I decided to try to find new ways to unravel his motives. It was the only thing left, to find a way to unravel his plan and stop him. My fight with him was finally coming to an end. I managed to figure out his plans and find a way to stop his manipulations. It was the end of a great psychological war that had lasted so long. After I was finally able to stop his manipulations, I felt that this was not the end. I was haunted by questions about whether the real end had come or if this was just the beginning of his plans. I began to pay attention to details that previously seemed insignificant. Perhaps it was these little things that could give me an idea of what still remained unknown. My fears were confirmed when I discovered that some of his plans were not fully implemented. He left me clues that indicated the fight was not over. I decided that I could not rely on chance. It was necessary to delve deeper and find out what other plans he might have left. My mind was working at the limit of what was possible. I began to receive new alarm signals. These were small but alarming signs that something might be wrong. His shadow was still there even when I tried to ignore it. It turned out that his plans included not only me, but other people as well. I began to understand that he had a wider purpose than I could imagine. I gathered all the evidence I could find and turned to the experts. This helped me expand my understanding of his tactics and perhaps reveal aspects that have not yet been elucidated. I learned that his plans were not only psychological manipulations, but also real threats to other people's lives. My struggle became more and more urgent. During the investigation, I came across documents confirming his numerous crimes. It was proof that his influence on people was much greater than I could have imagined. I started to feel the pressure when I realized that he might attack again. I could not afford to be irresponsible, so I began careful planning. My tactic was to use all the data gathered to formulate a final counter strategy. This required maximum concentration and calm from me. I felt that my mind could no longer withstand the pressure. Anxiety and fear became constant companions, and I had to find ways to cope with them. My plan was to find and destroy all possible sources of his influence. I began to carefully follow his every step. I again turned to criminology experts for further advice. It helped me better understand how to manipulate the situation. My efforts were worth it when I finally found a new trail. It was a discovery that could lead me to new evidence of his criminal activities. I discovered that he used numerous fronts to expand his network. This made my struggle more difficult and required extra effort. My struggle became even more complicated when I realized that he had big plans that required careful analysis and coordination. I began to notice that his methods had become even more aggressive. He tried to destroy my resources and undermine my efforts. My attempts to find new countermeasures proved difficult. He always found ways to control the situation and leave me in limbo. I decided to take a big step and contact the law enforcement authorities with all the available evidence. It was risky, but maybe it would help stop him. My efforts paid off when the law enforcement officers began an investigation. It was a step forward, but I knew the fight was not over yet. I learned that he has hidden reserves that may help him avoid justice. This became a new source of anxiety for me. My actions became more cautious when I realized that he could have countless other plans. Each new day became another test. I began to feel that I needed to find new allies to fight him. Maybe this will help me find new ways to counter it. My efforts to find allies proved successful. I found several people who could help me fight him. I learned that his plans have become even more complex and large-scale. He used all possible methods to keep the situation under control. My struggle became even more intense when I realized that he was using new tactics to avoid detention. It was a difficult task that required a lot of concentration. I decided that I needed to use all the available resources to achieve the goal. It required a lot of effort and resources. My new allies became an integral part of my strategy. With their help, I was able to get new information and find new countermeasures. I learned that he continues his crimes using new methods. This increased my anxiety and forced me to be even more careful. My fight against him became even more difficult when I realized that he was using new manipulation techniques to extend his control. I decided to use all available resources to stop him. This required considerable effort and constant monitoring of his actions. I began to notice that his plans were becoming even more convoluted and complicated. This made my struggle even more difficult and dangerous. My efforts to unravel his motives and plans became even more intense. I felt that every new day brought new challenges and dangers. I decided to investigate further to find out more about his plans and find ways to stop his criminal activities. My new investigative efforts gave me new insights into his plans. This allowed me to find new ways of countering. I began to notice that his actions were becoming even more aggressive. This forced me to be even more attentive and careful in my actions. My struggle became even more intense when I realized that he was using new tactics to destroy my efforts. I decided to take advantage of new opportunities to achieve my goal. This required considerable effort and constant monitoring of the situation. I learned that he has new plans that could endanger even more people. This increased my anxiety and made me act faster. My struggle with him became even more intense when I realized that his plans were becoming even more complex and large-scale. I decided to use all available resources to resolve the situation. This required considerable effort and careful planning. My new investigative efforts allowed me to find new countermeasures. I began to notice that the situation was becoming even more complicated. I decided to bring in additional experts for the investigation. It helped me better understand his tactics and find new ways to fight. My efforts to unravel his plans became even more intense. I felt that every new day brought new challenges and dangers. I learned that his plans are becoming even more aggressive. This forced me to be even more attentive and careful in my actions. My struggle with him turned into a real war. I concentrated all my forces on achieving the goal and stopping his criminal activities. I decided to take advantage of new opportunities to solve the situation. This required considerable effort and constant monitoring of his actions. My fight with him was coming to an end. I felt that I was already close to achieving my goal and stopping his criminal activities. The end was near when I was able to finally unravel all his plans and stop his criminal activities. My struggle is over, but the memory of these events will remain forever. After I managed to stop his criminal activities, I thought I could find peace. But after experiencing all this, I realized that fear will stay with me forever. I continued to follow the news, trying to find out if there would be any new reports about his activities. I still felt that his influence could last. It turned out that his crimes were not the only ones. I have found evidence that he may have accomplices or followers who continue his cause. I decided to continue the investigation, even if it meant new dangers and stress. I couldn't afford to leave anything to chance. My investigation led me to new individuals who may have information about his network. I tried to establish contacts with those who could be useful. I felt that my life became even more dangerous when I learned about new threats that could be associated with his accomplices. My fight against new threats became even more intense. I was constantly looking for new ways of protection and continued to be on the alert. I found information that indicated that his accomplices may have been part of a larger organization that had plans for the future. My attempts to discover the details of this organization turned out to be difficult and dangerous. I met with new difficulties and challenges. I began to receive new alarm signals when I realized that my actions could be under the control of this organization. I had to find a way to remain unnoticed. I decided to use new technologies to gather information to avoid direct contact with danger. This allowed me to get new data without risk. My efforts were successful when I found new connections in the organization. I learned that their plans were even bigger than I could have imagined. I decided to use this information to create a new counter-strategy. It required a lot of effort and resources from me. I continued to follow the organization's activities, trying to learn more about their plans and find a way to stop them. My struggle became even more difficult when I learned that the organization was using new methods to avoid detection. I decided to use the help of new allies to investigate. It helped me get new data and find new ways to fight. My new allies became an important part of my strategy. With their help, I was able to get new information and expand the investigation. I discovered that the organization has a multi-layered structure that complicates my investigative efforts. I needed to find ways to penetrate this structure. My fight against the organization became even more intense when I learned about their new plans and the threats they posed. I decided to use all available resources to achieve the goal. This required me to constantly monitor and carefully plan. My investigative efforts gave me new insights into the organization and its plans. I was able to find new countermeasures. I learned that the organization has new resources and support, which makes my struggle more difficult. I needed to find new strategies to overcome these challenges. I decided to turn to the experts for additional advice and information. It helped me better understand new threats and find new solutions. My struggle with the organization became even more intense when I realized that their plans were global in scope. It required even more effort from me. I began to receive new alarm signals about possible threats. This forced me to be even more attentive and careful in my actions. My new investigative efforts allowed me to uncover new details about the organization. I learned about their plans and methods of their implementation. I decided to take advantage of new opportunities to achieve my goal. This required considerable effort and constant monitoring of the situation from me. My investigative efforts led to new discoveries. I found new connections that helped me better understand the plans of the organization. My struggle became even more intense when I learned about new threats that could threaten me and other people. I decided to turn to new allies for help. It helped me find new ways to deal with organization. My new allies became an important part of my strategy. With their help, I was able to get new information and expand the investigation. I learned that the organization has new resources that allow them to avoid detection and continue their activities. This made my efforts to fight difficult. My fight against the organization became even more complicated when I realized that their plans could endanger even more people. I decided to use all available resources to achieve the goal. This required me to constantly monitor and carefully plan. My investigative efforts allowed me to find new opportunities to counter the organization. I was able to get new data and find new ways to fight. I began to notice new warning signs that indicated that the organization might be using new tactics. This made me pay even more attention. My investigative efforts became even more intense. I learned about new aspects of the organization's activities and their plans for the future. I decided to take advantage of new opportunities to achieve my goal. This required me to constantly monitor and carefully plan. My struggle with the organization became even more confusing and complicated as I learned about new plans and the threats they posed. I continued to follow the activities of the organization, trying to learn more about their plans and find ways to counter them. My investigative efforts allowed me to find new connections and details that helped me better understand the activities of the organization. I decided to take advantage of new opportunities to achieve my goal. This required considerable effort and constant monitoring of the situation from me. My struggle with the organization became even more intense when I learned about new threats that could threaten me and other people. I decided to turn to new allies for help. It helped me find new ways to deal with organization. My new allies became an important part of my strategy. With their help, I was able to get new information and expand the investigation. I learned that the organization has new resources and methods that complicate my efforts to fight. I needed to find new strategies to overcome these challenges. My fight against the organization became even more intense when I realized that their plans could endanger even more people. I decided to use all available resources to achieve the goal. This required me to constantly monitor and carefully plan. My investigative efforts gave me new insights into the organization and its plans. I was able to find new countermeasures. The end of my struggle came when I was finally able to unravel all the plans of the organization and stop their activities. My struggle is over, but the fear and worry will stay with me forever. This expanded version of the story highlights the complexity and tension of the fight against a serial killer and his organization, showing all the difficulties and strategies necessary to achieve the goal.